First thing to say is I'm a proud graduate of York University, a little bit earlier than you, as you can tell. I didn't do an industrial or an MBA. I did a degree in English literature, which I must say has been incredibly helpful over the years. No, it is. Peter Drucker once wrote that the best degree to do if you want a management career is English. And I read that long after I made that decision, so thank goodness. I mentioned his name because I'm about to quickly invoke his spirit in just a moment. A couple of things I quickly want to say about this idea of systemic social change. The first is, I think, whenever you want to do something really practical about the problem, it's often worth thinking about whether you need to spend some time reinventing the theory. And I think part of our problem here, including everything you've just heard from the folks from the UK, is that too much of our effort around systemic social change is being fueled by the wrong theory of the business. The notion of a theory of the business is actually a Peter Drucker idea from 1994. And his essential thesis was that any organisation or system or institution has a set of assumptions about its business and about how it fits reality. It basically links its mission, its capabilities, and the context. My big argument would be, particularly within government and within the public space, we are trying to find a new theory of the business, and designers are absolutely critical, because I think fundamentally the theory, the assumption that drives too much of our work around social change, particularly within the public space, is incorrect, because the world has moved on, but the institutions and the systems are struggling to keep up. Now, it occurs to me, as I listened this morning, that designers are in fact serial reinventors of theories of the business. That's exactly what designers do all the time. Let's go back and you talked about mapping out. You start mapping things out, you're essentially implicitly questioning every single set of assumptions that actually create how you behave. And that's essentially what Drucker argued is missing in many of our businesses and institutions, and I think we've got a big problem in government. Fundamentally, I think, we still have an assumption that the theory of the business in government is about the collection and curation of public power, not the serial solution of problems. Not to say that we don't try and solve problems, but there's a set of assumptions that drive fundamental, deep DNA kind of assumptions about what we're doing in government that effectively say our job primarily is to conserve our power, particularly if we happen to be in one of those big fat silos. Our job is not primarily to solve a problem. Because if it was your assumption that you were there to serially solve problems, you would behave in a completely different way. And you would use your power, of which you need to have some, in quite different ways. So my first observation is I think all of us who are in this space need to give a lot more attention to reinventing some of the theories of our business around social change, because I think many of them are wrong. And I think it doesn't matter how hard we try, no matter how hard we work. I've spent a lot of time with the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, on whose board I sit. I'm doing work at the moment with PwC around their social impact factors. We're all working very, very hard. Seriously, we couldn't work harder. And here we are on a Saturday morning. How hard can you work? And that isn't the issue. It's not how hard we work. It's whether the assumptions we make about the world in which we're trying to operate are right. And if they're wrong, it doesn't matter how hard you work. The Peter Drucker article is worth reading. It's 1994, Harvard Business Review, Theory of the Business. Very simple, very powerful explanation. Designers, I think, get it completely intuitively. The second observation I want to make is roughly what's on this slide, which is a little bit scrappy, but it's an attempt to try and push an idea that, in fact, the Centre for Social Innovation and a lot of other people, including some of our own policy labs, one here in Sydney, one in Melbourne, is trying to push, which is that in Australia, what we definitely do not have in the social space is the kind of integrated, predictable and reliable R&D system that we would expect to see in areas like medical science and technology and manufacturing, which links research, money, prototyping, scaling, evaluation. In the social space, almost every one of those pieces of the pie are all somewhat haphazard. I'm not saying we don't get on with it, we do lots of work, but how they are linked together is quite haphazard. And it certainly isn't an integrated system where you could sit back and say, yep, in Australia we have a very predictable, very well understood system that allows us to take research and knowledge through to action in a very consistent way. Too many of us are trying to invent such a thing separately. And if you think about what happens in places like medical science, pharmaceuticals, industrial research and so on, in those fields, there are systems and institutions and practices which constantly get used and reused and shared. Like everyone knows what the game is, reasonably comfortably. In the social space, we don't. In the social space, and if you go and look at not just work that's been done here, but you go and read folks like Charlie Leadbeater and some of the work that Hilary Cottam has just been writing in the UK about the welfare reform. We don't do that. We make up all of these pieces on our own separately, and then we wonder why we're not making progress. So, quick recap. I think we need a new theory of the business, because I think part of our problem is we're all working terribly, terribly hard with a theory of the business that's not quite right, which means that we are not going to make that systemic shift. That's the first observation I would make. Second observation I would make, and it's a little bit of a call to action, and you'll see more of this over the next few weeks and months. I think in Australia we need to very consciously start building a genuine social R&D system for the nation that actually starts to pull this stuff together in much more predictable, reliable, and frankly, less exhausting ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to speak to us more about who we are as social change agents. So, how many would you say you spend most of your waking hours working to create a better world? Okay, how many of you studied to do that? Like, invested some time in studying professionally? Okay, so I did too, and I did a master's in social work, and I did a master's in community management, and I now teach at the Centre for Social Impact. And what I'm going to riff a bit off Martin, because one of the things I think we need to think about how do we create systemic change is we've got to move off an addiction to linear solutions. Because I spent all those years studying to learn to be a great change agent, and actually all that reinforced in me is if you have a problem and a predetermined solution, you can get a predictable outcome. And our system is addicted to this way of thinking. And actually everything we've just said in the room this morning says we now know as social change leaders, and probably intuitively as a country and politicians, that this way of working isn't going to apply now or into the future. So I think if we're committed as social change agents to make systemic change, we have got to commit to creating a movement of systems change leaders, which means we've got to learn how to do systems change and move off a programmatic and programmed response. So we need systems change leaders everywhere, not just in community and in service delivery. We need them in government, we need them in business, we need them desperately in philanthropy. And we don't have enough of them in any parts of our social change sort of infrastructure in Australia. So to me, we've got to sign up to a mission of systems change leadership. The next one, I'm bringing 5 by the way, 5 in 5 minutes, is so in my social change, 20 years, I think I've only been working in systems change for the last 7, genuinely. Genuinely. And I've actually found it the most personally challenging work I've ever done. And I was a drug and alcohol outreach worker with a secondary needle exchange in my car for many years. And working in systems change is harder than that. Because what we don't do very well, or what we know we have to do in systems change, is get really good at spotting patterns. We talked about that this morning. So what are the patterns in the system that are keeping the problems in place? So if we get really good at pattern spotting, which is core skill, we've got to get just as good at seeing how we are perpetuating those patterns. So unless we can put ourselves in the system and start saying, I have power and influence as a social change agent, and what am I doing in my change to disrupt the very patterns that I'm trying to see out there changing the system? Systems change means you've got to self as well as system. And we don't talk enough about this, that how do we actually, can we go to the next one? How do we become very aware of our own power? Because until we start owning our own power, stepping into our own power and learning really quickly how to grow that power, share that power and pool that power in service of purpose, the aligned goals on the filings, until we start doing that ourselves, how can we ask others to do that? So the organisation I work with spends most of our time working in place-based systems change. Probably half of the communities we work with are Aboriginal controlled or Indigenous controlled change processes. And they feel the most disempowered in the system, and they are doing all of the work of understanding how much power they do and don't have, working really hard to grow that power, and then partnering with others to increase the authorisation of the change they want to lead. And I don't see other people doing that. I don't see governments thinking, or people in government thinking, how can I use my power, share my power with others who are aligned to the same goals? And doing that openly and explicitly. See it in patches, we need to be doing it across the whole system. Thank you, Jack. And we talked again about this morning. It's almost like we do our learning somewhere else, and when we come to do social change work, we become experts. So there is some magic that happens, and we've heard about it in the policy lab and in many of the spaces when we find rooms and places where diverse people come together and are facilitated to take off their expert hat. That the environments are safe enough for vulnerability to emerge, for new learnings to happen. And this is learnings that where we all acknowledge we have a piece of the puzzle, but none of us know the solution. This requires safety. This requires investment in trust and relationships. And it requires us to be able to handle conflict, like work constructively with conflict. And all of this practice, is a sort of an adaptive leadership lens that is part, I think, of becoming, what the sort of capacity we need to be systems change leaders. How do we hold large groups of people through uncomfortable learning to get to a better place? And the last one is systems change and innovation go hand in hand, but innovation often happens only in bursts. And so the systems change that we're observing that is actually driving change for whole communities or whole regions, where now the very things that they kept them awake at night are reducing. So I'm going to speak very briefly about a community in far west New South Wales that my colleague here has been to in Burke. Yep. So one in 5 children was in jail every night. So 7 years later, they now have reduced crimes to the lowest levels of that community. In 2013, that community had a Sydney Morning Herald article that said Burke more dangerous than any American city. This is because they have relentlessly, incrementally innovated over 7 years and had a whole bunch of people from all over the system walk beside them to do that. So this systems change work can happen in bursts, but if we want to change lives for whole populations of people, we've got to stay the course and do it together over the long term. That's it, that's my 5 things. I just want to say one more quick thing, if we can go to the next slide. We're a little non-profit that builds capacity for systems change. We're about to launch an online learning platform called Platform C on how to do systems change in place. So I wanted to flag that. And we're recruiting, so come and talk to us if you're looking for a job in systems change.
Thanks, Jackson. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you this morning, and thanks so much for the presentation. I feel like I've been wanting to meet you for so long, so it's really great we're finally in the same room. So I want to talk very briefly, just I suppose to some extent, theory of design rather than theory of business or theory of change. So we've heard a lot about design processes that have been informing policy development, policy innovation. And on the matrix that I think Sanjan put up, which Andrea has produced to some extent, obviously one is trying to get to a situation in which something is legislated and in which that legislation is actually being enforced, in which case you have structurally changed society. So you're trying to get there, and all of us are wondering how we can get there, how we can walk with people in the room, how we can enable these sorts of things. So I just want to talk very briefly about the role that I think design itself as the materializer of things plays in that. I think it's very important to recognise that if you are trying to make a change in your life, it will be effortful, it will take a lot of effort. One hopes that at some point it becomes habitual. And that transition is often enabled by a boundary object, which might be a design. Now, unfortunately, most designs' theory of change is if you make it simpler or automatic, or a little more delightful, people will do it. And that's all well and good, except if your larger vision of society is one in which people are doing things more manually because it might be more sustainable in the carbon budget sense, doing things more awkwardly because it's actually a kind of social engagement in which we are learning to develop collaborative decision making. If you have a theory of change which is you materialise things so that people can then make them habits, but if your theory of change is you can only materialise things if those materialising things make things easier, then we have a problem if we're trying to shift to a society in which some things have to get harder. And they have to get harder in particular for the people who have it easy at the moment. So not for the kind of people that we're trying to help, but generally for the wealthy people who can afford all the design gadgets that Johnny's produced. So I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that I think part of systems change are designers learning to design things that enable change in the same way that a legislation will have indicated a system change. Having put something in a built environment, having put something in our pockets, having put something actually physically in relation to how we live, that is also a structural change. But we need the sorts of things that are actually going to foster more effortful ways of being and try and break a cycle of dependence upon ever-increased convenience and speed. Now that's a big challenge. I'm not exactly sure I know how to do it. I know that there are lots of objects that are designed there to sometimes slow you down for safety reasons. There are ways of mediating conversations online that would cause you to think a little bit more about what you're about to post online. I could certainly do with one of those. There are examples of designers using their exact same understanding of human material interactions to slow things down and to promote the value of effortful engagement. People design gym equipment, for example, right, which isn't there to make life easier. So we have these examples and we need more of those so that we can actually do systems change toward a society in which people are taking more responsibility at a more effortful level for actually engaging with each other to do the kind of collaborative decision making we need for something like climate change. Thanks.
My current role is I work in the New South Wales Treasury, but I've done many, many different things. I've got a few colleagues in the room, ex-colleagues in Andrea and Michelle. So I worked in the UK for about 10 years. My first job was in Parliament. I've worked a lot here, but then I've spent a lot of time working with politicians, both in a non-political neutral role, but working with a real diversity, whether they were committees set up to look into issues that mattered to Londoners, to issues here in New South Wales, to working and advising ministers in the Cabinet Office. And also the politicians who were trying to keep an eye on the mayors of London, including Boris, who's now obviously the Prime Minister of the UK. But then have jumped around going into NGOs, working in philanthropy, working at the heart of government, but also in large consultancy and boutique consultancies here, including Taxi, FutureGov, and now I find myself in the Cabinet, in Treasury. So I'm part of the commissioning team there, and I'm bringing in human-centred design and systems thinking to inform some of our ways of working. We're there to advise and support agencies across New South Wales Government. We're a tiny team of me and someone I've convinced to come in part-time, but I'm growing it. So by the end of September, I'm going to have 4 of us there at the centre, trying to change how Treasury works, but also how bits of New South Wales Government work. I'm speaking today in my own capacity. These are my opinions, they're not the opinions of the New South Wales Treasury. So for me, there's a couple of things. We've already touched on mental models, but I want to talk quickly about those. I want to talk about the boring revolution, stealing that from a guy called Andy Johar, and I want to talk about power. So these are some of the things we've already discussed here today. But quickly, I just want to start with a silver bullet and say there is no silver bullet in this space. I think we know that. I think we've heard that loud and clear today, but just to emphasise it. But this is one of the mental models that obviously I'm up against, navigating within government. We love the silver bullet. We can't help it. There's something about the way we're organised, the way we're trained, the types of people that work in government, the expectations put on us by ministers and those from the top. We want the silver bullet. So that's obviously a kind of a sign of the mental models we operate in. And so for many of my peers and colleagues, we operate here at the centre. We are at the centre of government in Treasury and DPC. For those of our colleagues in agencies, we're kind of actually on the outer end. We don't actually deal with real people. We deal with the money. We look after the treasure. When I talk to my family, I go, how's the treasure going? I don't know. For people, for citizens, for people living in New South Wales, we're not even on the picture. Who is Treasury? What is Treasury? Nobody knows who we are. So I think that being conscious of the part of the system that you're operating in, Kerry talked about and others have referred to, is really important. And so part of the work that kind of influences part of the mental model I think about is where am I in that system and how can I make the biggest impact in what I'm doing and the team of mine. So just some other illustrations of the types of mental models we operate in. This is, quote we've all heard probably in our own jobs, but also is a common one in government. It might be, there's a rule that means we can't do something, but when you actually dig into it, you realise that it's not a rule, there's no legislation, it's the thing we've always done, we've never interrogated whether we can do it or not. There's also things around value and what do we consider as valuable in government, particularly in Treasury. What is of value there? Is it balancing the books or is it actually the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for the people that live in our state? There are signs and there's trends in government moving towards that. We're still a far way of knowing what those real outcomes are and how we get to there, but we are starting to try and change those mental models. Just quickly, we also need a boring revolution. So this is something Indy Johar talks about. I've got a link to his article at the back. So for me, I'm thinking through how does money flow through the system? So maybe that's not a boring thing because obviously there's power attached to it, but for many people it is a boring thing and designers need to go and engage with how funding flows through systems. Power sits with that and that influences what decisions get made and then ultimately what services we offer out there for the people that use them. In my work, I also think about contracts a lot. How do we renegotiate contracts? Where do we share risk between government and communities? That's something we need to be thinking through. It's a boring thing, but it's something that has a fundamentally important impact on the outcomes that we can achieve or not. Another thing is thinking through the piping that flows through the system that we operate in government. So we get excited about the frontline services and how the types of things that we offer out to people, rather than thinking about ourselves and how we actually operate. A lot of people have got a lot of pressure on them and there's a lack of time. Part of that is a mental model, but it's also the fact that we're operating in systems that are inefficient, not easy to use for ourselves. So we spend a lot of time on that internal bureaucracy and paperwork and the internal piping because it's not been designed properly, or it's been designed for an old world. I think power, obviously, and that's something we all have in different ways depending on our background and context, but it's also something that many public servants don't feel they have. So we operate in our own system and there is hierarchies and power imbalances within them. So one thing I'd say, be conscious of that when you're working with public servants. They actually can feel quite disempowered. They don't own each lever in the system. They operate within a system that no single person, not even the Premier, controls that lever. Not even the head of the DPC. I control no levers. So it's understanding that context in which we operate as well. It doesn't mean we should try and not be empowered and challenge the mental models and the context we work in. Another quick thing, just a small way of how I'm trying to change that is trying to move to being more sharing about the types of work we're doing. Having Andrea in yesterday at Treasury was really powerful, getting her to share the work and Sanjan the work that they've been doing in the UK government. I've got people who've responded to that incredibly powerfully, like comments on LinkedIn and people going off back to their offices and going, right, what do we do to apply this to our own context? So for me, it's not just the work I do today, but it's the networks that I can try and build among public servants as well to try and learn from each other and share the good work that we're doing. Another thing just quickly around power is people often those that do feel that they have some kind of power are conscious of wanting to use it effectively, but we don't always know how to. So there's work I've been doing with different agencies who go, I want to spend my money, I have this responsibility to spend my money, I've got a budget, I've got time to spend it in. I can't mess around with designing it, I have to deliver it. So it's being conscious of that pressure that people are under, rather than, and so for me it's helping them to flip that to go, actually it's ethical to design it first. We can't go and deliver something that we haven't actually designed or tested before doing it. But there is this push for going, I feel it's right for me to spend that money, I've got it, I know there's demand, I know there's need out there, I must spend it. So that's my provocations to you guys. Donella Meadows is one of the things that I think through in terms of thinking through levers in the system and where I can be most powerful, and Indy Johar talks about all the boring revolution stuff we need to be thinking about.
As I thought about, what was the question that I wanted to propose to the group, and Jax's invitation to ask a provocative and bold question, it occurred to me that really was, at the risk of being too meta, that is the question, is how can we be more bold in the pursuit of social impact? Because I think nothing else that we've heard, nothing else that we want to happen is going to be possible without a certain amount of boldness and courage and risk-taking that is mostly currently lacking. And the reason that matters so much, of course, is the world itself is simply changing too fast now. So it's, as some of the previous presentations mentioned, it's not enough for us to create an innovation. We need to build a fundamental ecosystem that is capable of constantly spinning up new approaches to social change, because the environment around us is going to constantly change. And I truly believe that the biggest change that has occurred in the world is the pace of change itself. And that's changed all of our relationship to change as well, if you think about it. 1,000 years ago, people didn't really believe in change. To the extent that any change happened, it was fated by higher powers. Throughout history, we've mostly thought that the role of change maker was, the exclusive domain of these very rare, history-changing individuals, conquerors and prophets, religious leaders and revolutionaries. And that was simply because most of us couldn't see change within our lifetimes. If you were, the son of a blacksmith in a village in France, you were more often than not going to spend your life in that village and become a blacksmith. And that was true in most parts of the world. Now, of course, because we see change happening constantly, it's not just that we assume that everything's going to change all the time. We now see our own impact in that. So while change is overwhelming and accelerating, we've also actually, in some ways, democratized it on a cultural level. That people now think about the impact of their individual decisions, who they work for, who they buy from. And so I think we've got greater human capacity for change than ever before. And the role of the system, as Martin said, is how do we harness and elevate and scale the best of that human ingenuity that's already out there. And it's my real belief that the world is abundant in solutions. We're just bad at identifying them and bad at scaling them up. Martin mentioned the ecosystem. In some ways, that's how he talked about how medical research and science happens today. It's an interconnected ecosystem. But it wasn't always like that. That's actually quite a recent invention. Only a couple of 100 years ago, science happened the way social innovation happens now, which is completely disconnected people solving everything repeatedly. Almost everything. There are a few genuine genius breakthroughs, but if you look back through science, almost everything was discovered multiple times. The theory of evolution was discovered twice. Darwin didn't publish it for a couple of decades, leaving everyone else to figure it out again, and then he rushed into publication just before he was scooped. And that's how actually a lot of things happened. It was people who got to do science, of course. It was people with the leisure to pursue their interests. It was primarily these kind of rich eccentrics who actually were responsible for an awful lot of scientific progress. And so that's kind of how, I don't mean to call anyone an eccentric, with the exception of that, that's kind of what the social innovation ecosystem looks like now. We're inventing everything repetitively all around the world. We're struggling to identify the solutions that already exist within our communities, and those solution holders, I believe, are normally the people who experience and live the challenges, but they're not always the ones who know how to package up their insights or who get invited to speak at events like this to share their insights with us. And so the work that I do now and the work we do at Start Some Good is about how do we inspire, unearth, skill up and test and launch community-led social innovation projects. And part of the reason we do that was some time I spent in San Francisco some years ago and beginning to really understand what a pro-innovation ecosystem looks like. I'd previously founded, as was mentioned, an organisation called Sabherwal, during which we'd done a bunch of what I consider to be pretty innovative stuff. We sent 18-year-olds out on the campaign trail during federal elections, with that elite group of press corps journalists travelling around with the Prime Minister and the opposition leader during the federal election, there in the press conferences to stick their hands up and ask questions from a youth perspective. We opened the first co-working space in Australia, which continues to operate to this day on Harris Street, started on Pitt Street. And over the 8 years that I led the organisation, I raised just shy of $1 million, which sounds like a lot, but is, divided by 8, not a lot, over the course of that time. No money for the first 3 years, pure sweat, pure hard work by a bunch of passionate volunteers, university students mostly. And it was incredibly hard to raise money. Why? Because I couldn't prove that anything we were doing was going to work. No one had done it before. I couldn't prove that I was capable of making it happen because I hadn't done it before, and I was some overconfident 20-something. And therefore it was incredibly difficult, naturally, to raise the money from all the capital holders in the social innovation ecosystem. And the insight that San Francisco gave me was that an innovation ecosystem requires 2 types of investors, essentially. And in the commercial world, those are known as angel investors and venture capitalists. Angel investors are largely investing their own money, and they're doing so at an early stage. They're doing so based almost entirely on that pattern recognition skill that Kerry mentioned, on kind of a certain gut instinct and a certain excitement to discover what's possible in the world. They're not what's crucial though is they're not investing in investable companies. These companies are not investable because they have no metrics to justify investment. The secret of investment and investability in the commercial world is it's almost impossible to become investable if you haven't already received investment, because you don't then have a robust model of what money could do for your company. If you've never had money to spend, you have no acquisition model. You don't know what the real lifetime value or the cost of acquisition or all of the data that is needed to make smart decisions on investability. And so how they overcome that is there's emerged a category of investors in Silicon Valley who are willing to take those risks. But crucially, if you're investing that early, you have to know that you're not smart enough to pick accurately. No angel investors think they can actually pick the right companies. And so what they do is they invest in lots of companies. The only way to discover what's actually going to work is to try things. Then venture capitalists wait until companies have actually spent that money, done a bunch of things, have a bunch of data, have things like unit acquisition costs and lifetime value and burn rate, all of that stuff, and then they look at that data and go, is that going to work? And then they invest other people's money in scaling up those businesses. The social innovation or the social investment ecosystem is a world of all VCs and no angels. And it's because we don't know how to think about the trade-offs involved. Money is so simple as a metric. And every company, no matter what industry, comes down to the same core set of metrics: profit and loss, return on investment, and so on. And so angels are able to make those bets knowing that the equation is that they need one company to deliver 100x and it pays for the portfolio. Who is doing that and who is willing to do that for social change? Because without that, we can't actually get the breakthroughs we need. So if I could just leave you with one thought, and I'll open it up to all of you if you have a name for this phenomenon, because if no one's named it yet, I'm calling it the Dawkins Law. And that is that good ideas look like good ideas, but great ideas look like bad ideas. And good ideas look like good ideas because they build on the status quo. They don't violate or challenge our assumptions too much. They say, here's this thing that works, imagine if it could be a bit better in this way. And you go, oh yeah, that's a good idea. It should be better. But great ideas break our understanding of the world. They violate our assumptions in some ways. They're counterintuitive. They're outside the box. And so most people will look at that and go, that won't work. And they're right. It mostly won't work. But the only way to differentiate the genuinely great ideas from the actually won't work ideas is to try things. And so how can we get bold out? How can we switch the question we ask? What I learned in Silicon Valley is that the question that investors ask is not what will happen, but what could happen. And in the social change world, we always ask what will happen. And if we're not convinced that something will happen, we mostly don't support it. So my question to you is, how do we change that language from will to could, from certainty